Hello and welcome to the Space Between Ideas. I'm Blaine Gates. Welcome. Wow. So we are officially finished winter, and yeah. So I'm just wearing, whatever. Mr. Gordon D. Gordon, my dog, is just sleeping underneath me. Here we go. Okay, let's try to get comfortable. And we've officially survived an entire winter with no heat, with no heated water, or no heated no heat in the house. So then just to prove that it can be done. And now it's like 20 degrees outside. So low temperature is not less than 10 degrees. So we are here. Okay. So he wants to sit on the couch. All right. So there you go. We made it. We've officially made it. And let's take a look at what we're doing this week. So we've officially finished well, today's going to be the first 7 weeks in our little challenge has been to talk about biology and to talk about geography and talk about a lot of different things about the development of the human race. And this week we're going to talk about the fur trade, but I don't know about Staples trap. I don't know what the Staples trap is. Huh. I guess we'll find out. So this week we're gonna talk about the fur trade in Canada, and then we're gonna move to epic number two. So once we get to epic number two, it looks like we're gonna be reading Wealth and Poverty of Nations, chapter 9, the China Mirage. Again, the Intelligent Investor. This one is Bradley. So Bradley, am I sharing the? I might be not sharing what I want to share. Let's do another share. There we go. Okay, so Bradley is, I'm pretty sure Bradley is the China Mirage. Yeah, so that's the China Mirage. Now, this is really big because Trump and the United States and China, they met this last week and nobody quite knows what it means. But it was like, we spent a long time looking at Trump pushing and bullying and really putting on a scene for the last 10 years. And then suddenly, this his little trip to Iran didn't doesn't seem like it didn't go as well as he had planned. And this is like the first major blunder where the whole world suddenly sees Donald Trump is not quite like what happened. Like, I thought you were the United States. I thought you could do anything. I thought you were the all-powerful country. I thought you were the indispensable nation. I thought you could beat anybody in a war. I thought you had the best technology. Well, you can't even beat Iran. So you go into a war, and then now you lose control of the Straits of Hormuz, and you don't have the critical minerals to produce more weapons. And then you go to China, and you're like, "Hey, China, can you please talk to Iran and tell them to open up the Straits of Hormuz? And also, can you give us critical minerals so we can make more bombs?" And like this huge, China is like huge, and Trump is like, you know what Trump looks like? He looks like, remember that one um, press, the press gallery? I don't know what they call it, the press. It's like this one dinner where they make jokes and stuff. And this was when Obama was in office, and Trump was like sitting there, and they're making jokes about Trump. Who, like, you want to be the president? Yeah, yeah, yeah. They were making all these jokes about Trump, and Trump was sitting there like, "Oh, I'm gonna defeat everyone." And then he did. So then he came in and he just fought and fought and fought for like 10 years. And he was like on top of the world. And then suddenly he makes this decision to go into Iran. And the only logical explanation is that either he truly thought that Iran was going to capitulate and that they would just be defeated the same way as Venezuela. Or because if you look at the Straits of Malacca, you can see that they obviously they started to make some agreements with Indonesia before the Iran conflict began. And so if they started making these agreements without attacking Iran, then it's possible that the world would all focus on the Straits of Malacca. So this is like a little trick that I used to do for fun. So what you do is you walk up to someone and then you raise your hand like up here, and then boom, you punch them in the face, right? So they're looking at your hand and then you hit them in the face. And that was my assumption, was that the US was trying to make this deal with Indonesia in order to be able to make some installation so that they can control the Straits of Malacca. And if they do that without attacking Iran, then maybe the whole world is focused. Like, what is the US doing in the Straits of Malacca? So they decided to attack Iran just for cover. And nobody noticed that they now have struck this deal to be able to put in some US installations so that they can service their navy from across the ocean at this critical choke point. So that's one possibility. Otherwise, it's just stupidity. Like, it's just hubris. It's just some guy that thought he could conquer the world, and then suddenly he slipped on a banana peel. So, is it possible that Trump slipped on a banana peel? I just like, what happened? It's just I just don't believe it, because then you see these. He brings this whole crew. They go to China, and like, but they look so weak. Like, these are the biggest countries in the world. These are the biggest and most powerful companies in the world, with Mr. Trump himself, and they walk into China, and they just it's like they're knocking on the door, like, "Hey, anybody here?" It's like, "What?" Like, they look so small. I don't know, it was just so odd because okay, so for example, when Putin visited China, when remember when Putin and Modi and okay, maybe it was in Russia at the time. So China, I think China visited Russia, and there was like this picture of Putin and Modi and Xi Jinping. They're walking together, and you can see like they have this dynamic where they're like all talking to each other. They all feel like welcoming. They all feel you feel some kind of balance between this group of people. And from the photo op, what I saw from this thing that happened in China was it was like completely unbalanced. Like, Trump is like he's like walking into this gigantic place that he doesn't understand, and Marco Rubio is walking into this gigantic place that he doesn't understand. And the grandeur, they just it's almost like they're little turds in the bottom of a toilet bowl, and they're just spinning around, and they don't know where they are. The China Mirage. So now the point is, what is the China Mirage? Because maybe at the end of the day, actually, it isn't what it seems. So that's the issue. Now, let's focus on what we got going on today. So, yeah, so it looks like we're going to be focusing a lot on China. Here's another one with China, and then we got the intelligent investor, and then we got then the wealth of poverty of nations, and then we got back to the manias, manics, and panics. We're back into China, and then we're back into China. So in the next, the next 7 weeks is going to be extremely focused. It looks like what is it, 10 weeks? Huh. Actually, this is 10 weeks. So the next 10 weeks are going to be extremely focused on China, their morality and dynasty wealth, silver opium, feedback loop, the birth of Mr. Market. All right. Anyway, so now the issue today is the first thing is so I was reading this, I read the first three chapters of The Fur Trade in Canada, and there's kind of like a story arc. And I feel like the story arc has a lot of connection to the same story arc that we've been discussing. So it's the same kind of concept as like the past six videos, where we talk about geography, and then we talk about like some of the issues with geography, and then we talk about climate, and we talk about some of the issues about climate, and then we talk about the like how some groups of people are starting to move around and some of the issues they have, and then some have steel, and then and once steel appears, what's going on here? I'm just checking my audio. Hmm. I can't tell if there's a problem with the audio. Oh, I got the wrong earphones in. Hello, hello. Okay, let me just check. Oh, okay, fine. That's freaked me out because I thought we had the wrong audio. Okay, now we're back. Let's just jump and share the screen again. Back to the fur trade in Canada. All right, so I read the first three chapters of the fur trade in Canada, and it was like I could see the story arc that was kind of similar. And then suddenly we have steel tools. Then once we have steel, so then we were talking about this the Gulf Stream that brings all the moisture into Europe, and then and all of that moisture it helps to make the soil produce really really gigantic trees. And then the problem was humans; they had a hard time chopping down the trees until we get steel. And then once we got steel, then we were able to chop down the trees, and then we were able to use this really great soil in order to feed our animals. And then our animals got really big, and our people got really big. And like, look at me, I'm like, I have British blood, and I'm gigantic. I walked around the whole world, and I'm like bigger than 99% of the world. Why? Because my forefathers, they grew up in England, and they were able to have like a really good source of animal protein. And then eventually we moved into defending. We had because so we had like such a surplus that we were able to create banks. And then once we had banks of food and money, then we started like we had to use some kind of we had to use money, because how else are we going to keep track of not only, so it's not just food, and it's not just stuff. Like, oh, I have too much stuff, like I'm not going to have a storehouse of stuff. Like, we need something abstract to be able to start to trade with. So then we moved to money. We were using gold and silver, and then eventually, that's when we started talking about investing. So in today's video, I want to go through three different presentations. The first presentation, we're going to go and talk about the first three chapters of the book, Fur Trade in Canada, from the perspective of the Indian. And then the second one is going to be also the same type of presentation. I think the first two presentations are the same presentation. And then the third presentation is kind of like a summary of the last 7 weeks, but from the perspective of this book. So I'm not sure exactly how it's going to go. Let's go through the information as quickly as possible. So let's begin. The Beaver, the Blade, the Iron People. Two highly sophisticated systems collided over a single animal and a single metal. On the left, we have the original system, a complete sustainable ecology governed by relationships, thousands of years of accumulative geographic science, and strict social obligations. This is the Indigenous relationship economy. On the right, we have the market logic, a rigid, extractive European economic system driven by high oceanic overhead costs, seasonal demand, and the insatiable European fashion market, the European market empire. The catalyst, the introduction of iron, a technology so transformative it instantly rewired the economic survival imperatives of an entire continent. Now, just to go back to our summary, so the thing is that once you have a bank, see, the most important thing is that you have to have enough food. And then once you have enough food, then like you can start to look around. You can take a break, you can rest, you can start to focus on building more sophisticated tools. And then as you start to build more sophisticated tools, then that's when you're like, okay, well now like I need some sophisticated way to have a ledger for the value that I'm producing through producing these tools. And then that's when we have money. And then once we have money, then suddenly what we can do is then we have tools and money, and then okay, now we can build boats, and we can use our money to go and explore. And then once they explored, then they found there's this place in the west. And then once they got to the west, they're like, hey, look, there's some resources. We can use these resources, we can bring them back to Europe. By the time they got to Europe, the problem is that the indigenous people, so like, I mean, I haven't been in Canada for for a long time, so I'm not sure all of the politically sensitive like terms. So please don't, judge me too harshly about this. I don't want to get canceled just because I said something wrong, or so let's just, let's be merciful and kind and just try to do our best to get through this book without going crazy. I just feel like some topics have become overly sensitive, and obviously they're sensitive because look, the history is kind of sensitive. So let's begin. A heavy fixed capital and biologic The heavy fixed capital and biology of the beaver made it uniquely vulnerable to the blade. On the left, it says the asset, a barbed fur. The beaver possessed a unique downy underfur with microscopic barbs, making it mathematically perfect for the manufacturing highly durable felt hats in Europe. On the right, the vulnerability. Before iron, a foot thick lodge of frozen mud and wood was virtually impenetrable. Stone and bone tools could not break it. Iron axes reduced a forest to a trap in minutes. So the thing is, the issue was that the indigenous people, it was quite challenging for them to catch the beavers, and then also they kind of lived in harmony with their environment. And so there was just a huge number of beavers at the time. The fixed capital lodges span 20 feet across with complex underwater entryways. Beavers are non migratory. They invest heavily in infrastructure, tying them permanently to one location. Wealth was measured in the outward flow of generosity, not the accumulation of capital. So it looks like we have an indigenous leader. On the left, it says knowledge over possessions. The richest person was the one who knew every river bend and medicinal plant across 10,000 square kilometers. This wealth could not be stolen. On the right, it says sustainable management. Hunting territories were assigned to specific family bands. The purpose was not land ownership, but strict territorial responsibility to prevent overhunting. Trade as ceremony. You did not arrive, exchange goods, and leave. You stayed, feasted, negotiated. The physical object, a copper bracelet, a fur, was simply the physical proof of political relationship. Right. So it looks like the idea that's being presented here is that people, they lived at one with their environment, and they respected each other's territory, and they would trade in order to communicate with each other. So these are merchants. They have some kind of merchant life, but it doesn't look like they're trying to accumulate, but they're more trying to enjoy their life and enjoy the community that they've built. Dancing for trinkets was actually the rational recognition of geography unlocked technology. The Stone Age limit. Stone breaks, bone dulls, wood rots, boiling water requires dropping heated stones into wooden vessels, and massively labor intensive processes. On the right, we have iron revelation. Iron holds its edge. It can be resharpened. A portable iron kettle freed an entire camp from the geographical limits of immovable wooden cooking troughs. Les gens de fer. The indigenous people did not name the French for their religion or politics. They named them for the essential technological advantage they carried, the people of iron. So the book was interesting to kind of think about this idea where these indigenous people, they have knives, and they have some way of, like, they have a wooden pot, and then they drop heated rocks into the wooden pot in order to heat up the water. Like, it's very difficult. And they talked about how they had some, like, these big pots, and their whole community was anchored to this pot because they couldn't easily move. If they were able to build something to cook food in, then it wasn't easy to move that thing to another location. And then when they saw these metal kettles, they were just like, oh my goodness, you guys are awesome. And then they saw these metal knives, and they're like, oh my goodness, this is awesome. The cognitive gap between the craftsman and the crown. All right. So here's one example. So the Huron logic, the indigenous framework: power is derived from skill. The man who makes the most valuable tools is the most important man. Therefore, the king of France must be the greatest blacksmith alive. And they give an example of when some indigenous people, they travel to France, and then they see like a store that sells kettles, and then they just assume that's where the king lives, because that must be the most powerful person because he has the ability to create a kettle. And if you have a uh, a kettle that can easily be moved from location to location, then that means, like, you're the king of the kings. Like, at that, in from the indigenous mindset at the time, this is like the most important thing that we have in our community, and you solve this problem. The European framework: power is derived from inherited title. The king commands others to produce goods and extract surplus value. All right, so the Western world, in the European world, they already had this surplus value. They were already able to produce huge amounts of goods. They were able to produce huge amounts of food. They were already producing engines. They were producing clocks. They were able to harness the power of the water, and then they were able to produce more and more different types of tools. They had iron. Everything was going great, and they just had so much stuff that they're like, okay, we don't even know what to do with this anymore, so we need to create money. And then they have this ledger money system, and then they have banking, and then eventually they're like, okay, so whoever can control the money gets to. What do they say? That whoever, what is that saying? Whoever has the gold makes the. Oh yeah, the golden rule. So we used to have the golden rule, and now the new golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rules. The takeaway: the indigenous worldview was internally consistent and entirely logical. They were applying a rational framework to an alien civilization. The Huron engineered a sophisticated trade monopoly decades before the French established theirs. The agricultural advantage, the Huron semi agricultural surplus, the corn, allowed them to feed themselves on long canoe voyages, a necessity the northern nomadic hunters lacked. The middleman strategy, the Huron explicitly blocked northern hunters from meeting the French. They traded their agricultural surplus for premium northern furs, then traded those furs for French iron. Architects of the route. They controlled the Ottawa River passage, demanding tolls and fiercely protecting their market share against all competitors. All right, so it looks like one group has more power than other groups, and they were using some strategy. The brutal friction of Canadian geography dictated the economics of the European trade. All right, so at the top left, we have the cost of distance. Long, dangerous transatlantic voyages in small ships required massive guaranteed returns of high value, low weight goods. So, fur. Seasonal deadlines. The St. Lawrence froze. Trade had to be completed in a hyper compressed summer window, penalizing the slow relationship based Indigenous trade ceremonies. Is that true still? I wonder if the St. Lawrence River still freezes. The inevitability of monopoly, extreme overhead cost meant open competition ruined European merchants. This forced Champlain to form North America's first corporate trust to control prices and suppress internal rivalries. Indigenous traders engaged in price shopping, disinformation warfare, and rent seeking. What? Indigenous traders engaged in price shopping? Disinformation warfare. All right, I'm interested. Price shopping, 1611. Indigenous traders refused to trade with the first French ships that arrived. They deliberately waited for multiple competing vessels to anchor so they can drive the prices of iron down. Yeah, I remember that. So if you're the first ship, then you say, "Look, we have this iron knife. You're going to give me a lot for this iron knife because we only have 10 of these iron knives. They're hot. Everybody wants them." So then you wait until 10 ships, and now we got 100 iron knives. Look, we don't have to buy your iron knives. We got iron knives over here. Information warfare. To protect their monopoly from the French, the Hurons spread rumors to the neutral nations that the French lived on serpents and poison and had one breast in the middle of their chest. Okay, so they're trying to make the other indigenous people afraid of the French. Rent seeking and tolls. The Algonquins controlled the narrow rapids of the Ottawa River. They enforced ancient property laws by demanding heavy tolls in flour and iron from the Huron canoe passing through their territory. Fundamental incompatibility of gift economy and market economy. All right, so on the left, we have relationship economy, knowledge, and the capacity for generosity. A multi-day ceremony to cement survival alliances, strict territorial responsibility to ensure multi-generational yields, memory, reputation, unwritten customs. Okay, so this seems like a big family. I think this is the way that a family. So this is what happens when you have a small population and a limited resources. On the right-hand side, we got market economy, accumulated capital and surplus goods, a fast, efficient transaction to maximize volume. The price mechanism rewards maximum immediate extraction, written law, contracts, and inherited title. Yeah. So they have a very, very developed market economy, which means that you have such surplus of goods that now people who don't know each other, they begin to want to do business with each other, and then that's when you need laws and contracts and things like that. The technological shock of iron created an inescapable loop of dependence. As local beaver deplete, hunters must push further west into rival territory, requiring more iron weapons for defense. The cycle repeats. To buy, which way are we going? We're going right. Okay. Which one do we start with? I think we're supposed. I think we're supposed to start with this one. The iron tools immediately render traditional stone and bone tools obsolete. The knowledge to make tools fades in a single generation. Okay, so people stop making tools because why would you make tools if I can just buy one and the one I'm buying is more superior? Survival now obsolete requires European iron tools and muskets. Okay, so now you have to buy tools from the Europeans because if you don't have the tools from the European, then the other indigenous tribes will be able to conquer you. To buy iron, hunters must overhunt local beaver populations, violating traditional conservation rules. Okay, so now there's not only is there a problem with like everyone getting enough tools to protect your own group of people, but you're also stressing the land. And then once you start stressing the land and breaking some rules, then suddenly a local beaver depletion, hunters now push further west into rival territory, requiring more iron weapons for defense. A cycle repeats. So you're stuck. You're stuck. Now it's like the same thing right now. So what's happening with AI is like AI is like the new steel. And so okay, so what AI immediately renders traditional accountants, lawyers, problem solvers obsolete. The knowledge to make so then suddenly people they stop studying accounting, they stop studying things because you can just do it with AI. And in fact, if you don't use AI, you can't survive. But then now that you're using AI, then now the AI companies are becoming more powerful and they're disrupting other traditional businesses. So those traditional businesses, they're trying to figure out how to go to war against these new AI incoming groups of people. So like now we're waiting for the war of AI. When are we going to start pushing back? The price mechanism rewarded maximum extraction, destroying 10,000 years of sustainable management. All right, so we know that the whole economic system of the world is going to be upset because of AI adoption. It's the new steel. The death of the commons, a family that showed restraint and conserved their beavers simply lost their pelts to a neighbor who didn't. The market incentivized total depletion. Okay, so what is the market incentivizing? What is the market incentivizing? So the new steel is what is AI actually eating? The unheard warning. In 1637, the Montagnais came to French warning. Our country is being stripped of elk and other animals. We will be utterly lost. The invisible cargo. Epidemic diseases brought by the European ships devastated populations. European priests fatally misdiagnosed the biological contagion as moral failings, blaming indigenous gluttony for the mass deaths. Depleted territories and the influx of firearms tipped the continent into catastrophic warfare. The Dutch advantage, the Iroquois, having exhausted their own beaver supply, were armed with firearms by the Dutch on the Hudson River to aggressively secure northern furs. The annihilation shift. The war transitioned from low casualty, ritualistic territorial skirmishes into war of total economic annihilation. The fall of the Huron. In 1649 to 1650, the Iroquois entirely shattered the Huron monopoly, forcing the French to take direct, expensive control of the internal trade, fundamentally altered colonial history. The quiet loss of an entire scientific and ecological framework. The joking truth. A Montaigne man noted to a Jesuit, the beaver does everything to perfection. He makes for us kettles, axes, swords. He was describing with devastating clarity a society reduced to a single extractive loop. The beaver does everything to perfection. He makes for us kettles. So he's talking about the trade. The trade. So trading the beaver gets us kettles, axes, and swords. Hospitality to avarice. French observers noted the indigenous shift towards selfishness. It was not a moral decline, it was a rational, desperate adaptation to a new market reality where generosity no longer guarantees survival. Of the lost library, detailed scientific knowledge of reproductive rates, seasonal movements, and botany, unwritten but strictly real, was lost in a single generation as the elders died and the old skills lost their economic value. The elders are dying. The elders is like me, my generation. My generation, we're the last generation who knows a world without computers. They were not defeated by a superior intellect, they were out ironed. The final ledger. The market economy extracted the wealth of the Canadian Shield in a century. The relationship economy had managed it sustainably for 10,000 years. What survived? The languages, the political sophistication, the capacity for alliance, and the deep, unbroken relationship to the land survived the technological shock. The true narrative, a fair account of history, does not ask why they failed. It asks, given the devastating collision of an alien technology and an extractive global market, it is remarkable how much they built, how long they held, and how much they preserved. All right, now, so we might skip this one. Let's take a look at the first couple pages. It might just be repeating the first presentation. Let's take a look. All right, presentation 2, the people of iron. There is a history of North America written in the maps, treaties, and cargo manifest. This is not that history. This is the history of a conceptual earthquake, the story of highly sophisticated societies navigating a technological and environmental apocalypse and the iron that cut through their world. The currency of generosity. To understand the shock of iron, we must first understand the architecture of power before its arrival. Power was knowledge, not accumulation. The beaver was a partner. Wealth was hospitality. Trade was ceremony. So we covered this one. When the French arrived, they were not viewed as conquerors or divine beings. They were categorized precisely by the technology they brought, les gens du fer, the people of iron, for a culture dependent on a grueling labor instead of. We got this one. Discovering the laws of supply. The indigenous traders mastered the leverage of competition almost immediately. We got okay. So let's skip to the third. Yeah, this is all the same. This is the last one. Okay, so now this is the presentation which is supposed to take the narrative from the fur trade in Canada and then connect it with like the previous 6 videos. So let's see what happens. The beaver and the blade, the structural economics and systematic mechanics of the North American fur trade. The biological habits of the beaver functioned as an immovable economic handicap. So it says that the total market size, there were 10 million beavers across North America at this time. They had a reproduction rate of 20% annual yield. Product utility, the castor grass d'hiver, prime winter beaver, worn for 15 to 18 months to shed stiff guard hairs, leaving downy underfur perfectly suited for European felt hats. Fixed capital investment, immovable lodges, cemented with mud and sticks. In the language of economics, the beaver's fixed capital, its stationary lodge, and non migratory habits was an insurmountable handicap against the improved extraction technology of European iron. The introduction of iron reduced the depreciation schedule of the beaver's defenses to zero. So on the left, we have the stone economy, and on the right, we have the iron economy. So on the left, we have something where the extraction rate is less than the reproduction rate. On the right, we have the extraction rate is greater than the reproduction rate, which means the thick lodge of frozen mud is impenetrable to stone and bone tools. The ecosystem remains stable. On the right, we have defensive capital rendering completely obsolete overnight. When the arrival of the white people changed all their weapons from stone to iron and steel and added fatal gun, Every animal fell before the Indian. It's amazing, like all of Europe was had this wood. It's just this amass amount of wood. And the idea of having wood means that like you have really great soil because once you have these woods, then like it's covered in animals. And once you have animals and food for the animals to eat, then there's manure everywhere. And then the manure and also the leaves that are falling is producing the soil is getting thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker. And so we have this amazing soil, and then and they couldn't do anything about it before they had these iron axes. I mean, so as we studied before, like they were using some kind of method where they were able to burn the trees, but then like apparently after like 2 or 3 years, then the soil would lose its nutrients. And I still didn't find the reason why. Continental fur extraction required an entirely new logistical and corporate architecture. Okay, so the dimension, for example, the dimension geographical, coastal fishing, coastal Grand Banks, continental fur, deep interior Canadian shield, capital requirement, low overhead, seasonal return, extremely high overhead, extended supply lines, labor force, European sailing crews, complete dependence on Indigenous hunters and middlemen, transportation tech, ocean going vessels, the birch bark canoe, highly mobile, one man carry, essential for traversing rapids. Economic impact, incidental trade in fancy fur, systematic continent spanning staple commodity market. Now, this is talking about early. So it's not like it didn't actually start when the Europeans came over to North America. They didn't start doing they didn't start hunting beaver right away. They started doing coastal fishing, and then like as you can see, it says incidental trade in fancy fur. So at the beginning, maybe they would get a little bit of this fancy fur, but the main thing was that Europe had a huge market for the fish, and they also had some ability to salt the fish in order to be able to preserve the fish and take it back to Europe. And then, so the main thing was that the Europeans would come over, and then they wanted access to ports, and then they needed access to be able to dry and salt the fish, and then they would bring the fish back over to North America, to Europe. And then eventually, then at some point, some people brought some fur back over, and then probably someone said, "Hey, I like this fur. Can you get me more?" And then suddenly, wow, it's so important to get the fur, and then that's how it all started. Agricultural surplus served as the logistical fuel that enabled the Huron to operate as middlemen. So, what is an agricultural surplus? So, agricultural surplus means that this group of people, they had enough food that they were able to do other things. Like I remember there was a Peter Schiff video where he talks about there's like three guys every day they go fishing and they only have enough resources and time and skill to catch one fish a day. And then they bring that fish home to their family. Everybody eats the fish, and that's their life. They go out, they catch a fish, they bring it home, and that's it. So one guy, what he did, somehow he was able to, I don't know how he did it. I can't remember in the video. So he was somehow able to catch two fish. And then because he caught two fish that day, then he was able to spend one day developing some kind of net. And then so he had a new piece of technology. And then once he had the net, then he went back fishing the next day. Oh no, so he didn't eat. So actually what he did was he sacrificed. So he didn't eat one day and he just made a net. And then the next day he goes out to the sea, and then because he has a net, he caught like three fish. And so now with this technology, he's able to always catch three fish. Now, eventually, because he has so much fish, then he has to store them. And this is what's meant by agricultural surplus. So at some point when your people, and this is what we talk about, reliance upon geography and also reliance upon tools. And so for this group of people, the Huron, they were able to select some piece of land. They had enough tools that they were able to cultivate a surplus. And once you have a surplus, then you can start working in other industries. The Huron, positioned at the edge of the shield, source of corn, squash, and beans. A hunter must constantly hunt to eat, limiting travel. A trader carrying a surplus of lightweight, high calorie corn can travel for weeks. The Huron leveraged this agricultural advantage to dominate the canoe routes and command the interior price system, right? And so this is interesting because there's a lot of debate right now about surplus. I've been putting together some ideas about what's the first issue in government? Like what's the first problem that we need to solve? And it seems as though that the first issue, the most important issue that you have to solve in a government is about total government spending. Total government spending. All right. So government spending, we're talking about on the one hand, you're talking about how much money is the government, they call it government revenues. So how much is the government earning through taxation of the people? And then the other is how much money are they getting by borrowing money? All right. And the idea is that total government spending is the amount of money that the government is spending into the economy. Now, there's kind of some debate on this. Like Milton Friedman, he says that basically, when the government is told or asked to perform some kind of responsibility in the economy, it generally takes twice the amount of capital to produce the same outcome. So, if you let the private entrepreneurs do that business, then you're going to get twice the output for the same cost. And so there's this argument of saying, like, why is government getting bigger and bigger? Because the bigger and bigger the government gets, the more we have to collect in taxes. And it's like it's you get hit twice. And so on the one hand, the entrepreneur, the family who's paying taxes, they start to become demotivated. They feel demotivated. Like, why am I giving 50% of my of my earnings to the government? And then the government says, yeah, because we're providing for you all of these services. And it's like, yeah, but if the private industry produced that same service, they could produce it at half price. All right. So how about like you produce half the amount of services that you're now producing? So let's reduce the tax rate down to, let's say, 25% of my income. And then we can allow the private industry to resolve those issues in our country. And then the 25% that I used to give to the government, I only have to use like 12.5% of my income to get the same level of services. Right. So this is the Milton Friedman argument that we have to reduce total government spending. First of all, we need to reduce taxes, meaning that the government should not be so involved with producing goods and services in the country. And the second is about borrowing money. So the question is, why is the government borrowing money? So if the government is borrowing money, then it means that they don't want to, what? They don't want to make it obvious that like they don't have enough money, or they're spending money that they don't have. Or maybe they're like, yeah, but actually there's this argument that if you borrow money, the debt to GDP ratio, it, like, if you borrow money, you can actually get more GDP. It's the magic. Remember, we were talking about the magic. The magic is you take that money from the future, we bring it into our time right now. We can produce some revenue producing asset right now, and then we can enjoy the benefit of that revenue producing asset. Okay, so we have two questions. Question number one is the government using that money to pay for things like social services? And then when they pay for social services, is it true that the result of Canadians receiving those social services are able to then produce more? So that's, or like, the question is, how are they spending the money? Now, the second question is, at what point does the debt to GDP ratio cause a problem? All right. So let's say that the debt to GDP ratio is 50%. And in this case, the argument is that if I borrow a dollar and I produce something like a revenue producing asset, then at the end of the day, I'm going to get more than a dollar in a bump in GDP. But once your debt to GDP ratio gets over, for example, 90%, over 100%, then suddenly for every dollar that you borrow, you're getting less than a dollar in GDP, which means what? Which means that you have to take tax money, the money that you're taking in taxes, to pay for what? To pay for the interest on the loan. And then so now we're paying interest on the loan, meaning we're paying some bankers or some other country, we're paying them money for borrowing their money. And the investment that we make is not actually covering the cost to pay that interest. All right. So that means we have to reduce total government spending. We have to both reduce the money of services that should be provided by the private industry so that we can enjoy the benefit of actual entrepreneurs, people who are trying to cut costs and are trying to figure out ways to get a better product for a cheaper price. We also need to reduce the debt to GDP load because otherwise we're just taking tax money, we're giving it to bankers, and we're not getting an increase of GDP for the money that we spend. All right, so this comes back to this other question, which is like, all right, so now the government, they're taking a huge amount of our taxes and they're borrowing money. So we have this extremely high rate of government spending. And what are they doing with that money? And the truth is that to some extent, the government is picking winners and losers. So, okay, so is the government, are they focusing on, for example, an industry? Like imagine that they focus on supporting one industry. And why are they focused on supporting that industry? Is because that industry is competing with international forces. So they're not picking the winners and losers in that industry. They're picking the industry in order for that industry to be able to compete with other industries around the world. So I think that we need to focus on how is the government picking winners and losers? Because if the government is picking winners based on very specific types of companies, and then we find out that the government, the people who are making those decisions have some kind of stake, maybe they have shares in those companies who are winning, then we have a problem because then the government is picking, they're choosing to support certain types of companies in Canada for their own benefit. And finally, it goes back to the concept of like, what is the role of government? To what extent is the government's role to take care of everybody? Like, and if your role of the government is to take care of everybody, doesn't that mean that like you're now in a socialist state and you're moving ever closer to a communist government? And then once you're closer and closer to communism, that means that the government owns everything, and then the government is the one who gets to take the benefit from that capital. And now what happens is the people in government are no longer servants, but they are wolves in sheep's clothing. They create monopolies, they depress entrepreneurial spirit, they crowd out investment, and they're 2 times less efficient than private entrepreneurs. High overhead costs in transatlantic shipping forces the transition from chaotic competition to the first trust. Destructive competition in the early 1600s. The monopoly fixed a company of New France. Okay, what is going on here? High overhead costs in transatlantic shipping forced the transition from chaotic competition to the first trust. Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of what I was just talking about. So what happens is like when you're at this point of destructive competition, you have a lot of small players. 20 individual European ships arrive. Overhead costs are massive. Indigenous traders engage in price shopping, holding furs until multiple ships arrive to drive down the cost of European goods. Profit margins crash to zero. Champlain engineers a monopoly to control supply, fix prices, and guarantee returns. Right. So this is what's called a monopoly or an oligopoly, where you have a group of people that they in order for them to earn enough of a margin, particularly when they don't want to necessarily increase technology or to develop more competitive practices, then what they do is they agree to price fixing. The dynamic that produced the Dutch VOC and the East Indian Company produced North America's first corporate trust. The monopoly that extracted maximum profit from the land invested minimum resources into it. Okay, so here's another part. So this is one of the issues that we're facing in Canada. So there's this one argument from the NDP. They're saying, listen, so it seems as though that most of the grocery stores are owned by a limited amount of people. And so if there's like a small group of people who are completely controlling the food industry, or if there's a small group of people who are completely controlling the oil and gas industry, then is there an option where the government can get into this business and then um, produce a business which is not focused on profit? So, all right. So it sounds like the NDP wants the government to get into more and more businesses. And the question is, all right, maybe that's the way to do it, but maybe there's another way to do it. So maybe what you could do is when you have some mom and pop shops, maybe they can have some access to tax breaks. So tax breaks that the large box stores don't have access to. So rather than the government like building grocery stores and buying trucks and buying gas and doing all those kinds of things, why don't we just allow the people, the moms and pops who already have these kinds of stores, to have access to tax breaks? Isn't that easier? All right, the Crown's demand establish settlements, clear land, build an agricultural base for defense. On the right, monopolies, reality, settlers clear forests, destroying beaver habitat and hunt for themselves, creating competition. The fur companies actively invaded their charter obligations to bring settlers. Consequently, New France remained chronically underpopulated and the military vulnerable, perfectly illustrating the extractive logic of the staple trade. I have no idea what this slide says. The physical depletion of the resource triggered an inescapable cycle of geographic expansion and geopolitical war. All right, let's start on the right side. So on the right side, we got trade. Indigenous pelts are exchanged from European iron and firearms. Yeah, we got that. I think this is pretty clear for everybody. Depletion. Armed with new tools, hunters rapidly exhausted local beaver population. Yeah, we got that part already. Expansion. Traders are forced further west and north to tap untouched habitats. Yes, and that creates conflict. Encroachment into new territories triggers wars with rival middlemen. Yes. Escalation. Wars of annihilation require more guns and ammunition, which can only be purchased with more furs, driving the cycle back to step one. Okay, so if we go back to Europe, then I remember that we were discussing this. We were discussing like these different types of wars because once you have a bank, once you have the ability to develop a surplus, then you're going to get an increased amount of competition when it's easy to develop a surplus, right? Like if you suddenly can earn a lot more money, then a lot more people are going to want to also have access to being able to earn a lot more money for that same type of work. But what we didn't actually focus on was, did that war cycle continue in Europe? And it looks like the war cycle continued for some time in Canada. And the question is, at what point did this war cycle end? As supply lines stretched into the interior, control decentralized from the French crown to local habitat. The Company of New France on the left, pivot, 1645. The company relinquishes exclusive interior rights to the local traders. Habitants, maybe it's French, habitants. The fur trade demanded localized expertise, indigenous language fluency, and extreme logistical flexibility. A distant Europe monopoly could not enforce its will against the realities of the Canadian Shield. The power inevitably shifted from those intimately knew the land. Okay, so as you shift further and further north, then you don't have the same ability to monopolize the trade because it's more difficult to get the goods. Introduction of currency dismantled the ancient architecture of relationship-based trade. On the left, pre-contact, the barter economy, direct exchange of surplus, goal, social assurance, military alliance, reciprocity, local locus of control, local and relational, regulated by kinship. On the right, post-contact, the monetary economy, currency, fixed prices, and written IOUs. The goal, individual profit and capital accumulation. Locus of control, distant and institutional, regulated by European ledgers. The indigenous peoples operated a sophisticated economy backed by the assurance of reputation. The price system introduced a ledger they could not read and a currency they did not control. And this is the issue. So this often is like an issue in society, that when you when your society is focused on relationships and the relationships, because if you don't have a like a major surplus, if you don't have the ability to develop banks of money, then you're really connected. You have to connect as a community to survive. And then when suddenly there's like a surplus, then what happens is some people who are surplus minded, people who are capitalist, they start focusing on how to get that extra money. And then once they get that extra money, then they get access to different types of tools. That's what creates the K-shaped economy. The terms of trade were ultimately dictated by the party controlling the forge. The indigenous input, a renewable resource requiring years of ecosystem management, precise hunting, and months of manual skilled labor, changed into the European exchange, the artificial scarcity of renewable manufactured goods. The debasement. The indigenous trader gave a renewable resource that required immense skilled labor. In return, they received manufactured goods that constantly wore out, broke, or demanded constant replacement. Okay. The fur trade was the complete development sequence of European economics compressed into a single century. Yes, that's the point, right? So on the left, we have biology, the beaver's fixed capital defeated by the iron blade. Geography, the vast shield dictating the canoe and the extended supply chain. Corporate, transatlantic overhead forging the North American monopoly. System, depletion driving the vicious cycle of territorial war. Macro, the ledger price system permanently replacing the gift economy. No one can be praised or blamed for where their iron deposits were. The Canadian fur trade is not a simple story of triumph or victimhood. It is the brutal, mechanical inevitability of what happened when two complex civilizations collide. The only one only one controls the iron. So the question, one of the big questions is what is the next technology? What is the next iron? And who controls the iron? And that is the end of the presentation. Well, thanks again for joining me. And now we're going to begin our Epic 2, which is going to be about, that looks like 8 plus 9. So it looks like 9 weeks. We're going to be talking about the opium. We're going to be talking a lot about China. And everybody's talking about China these days. So let's go back into Chinese history and find out what is the dealio. Thank you for joining me here on the Space Between Ideas. And we'll see you next time.